Incidentally, this is closely linked, I think, to the ongoing changes in the European Union regulations of the topic. What would exactly now be better to see what's happening on the policy side of things? And thank you again to Eric and to his panel. And I would like to introduce our next speaker, Ines. You're welcome, public policy manager at IAB Europe, who will take us through the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and other policy matters that you need to know today. Yeah, Ines, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Stefan. I hope you can all hear me okay. If not, please let me know. So this keynote presentation is to bring you our corporate sustainability reporting guide that actually was published just a few weeks ago, so it's pretty recent. We can actually move to the first slide already. And as Stefan said, I also want to add a section here for today to speak a bit more about, okay, we have now in place the CSRD, but what is expected in the upcoming elections for the European Parliament? Are gonna be green rules still one of the items in the, as of priorities in the political agenda? Are they gonna be taking a backseat? So we're gonna also speak about that a bit. But just now on the guide, we drafted this guide along with our working group on policy and regulation, and also with the sustainability committee, with the idea to give a bit of an overview of this piece. I think it is actually a more complicated piece of regulation than normal, because it's not only the rules, it's also linked to standards. So it's very important to understand both things. And I think also in terms of a scope and timeline of application, it has its nuances and its complexities. So it's very important for not only IB Europe members, but also for the digital advertising industry to get an overview of what is this regulation. Is it going to affect my business? And if it is not affecting my business, am I going to need to be prepared somewhat to keep operating with business partners that are under the scope? So I hope today it brings you a bit more clarity on those ends. But as a disclaimer, I want to add this anytime I'm presenting the CSRD or any type of informational source, that this is not any type of legal advice. We always recommend for you to go to your legal team or your legal advisor, especially for the CSRD. It is very complicated in terms of scope and in terms of particularities within business activities. So it's always better to go to your legal advisor to get a proper legal advice. But without further ado, and already getting out of the way disclaimer, so what is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive? As you may know, it requires companies and also some SMEs to disclose non-financial information on ESG, so environmental, social, and governance performance. It entered into force in January 5th, 2023. So as you see, it's pretty recent. And it actually comes from the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, that it has a background of accountancy law. But these particular rules actually derive from the European Green Deal. So it came from that political agreement of improving the green rules across the EU and really making a change in terms of environment in the EU market. And I think we can summarize into three pillars what is contained in this regulation. First thing is transparency. So the objective of this piece of regulation is to promote a bit better the transparency in terms of what are companies doing for anything that has to do with ESG objectives, and disclose this information to investors and also to consumers. Then the other pillar is accountability, because it also intends not only to share this information, but also encourage companies to take action on the impacts on ESG that they are having, and also be more accountable for their impacts. It can be also environmental or social. And the last pillar are the standards. You may already have care about these standards. They are the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And this is basically the thing that derives from the law that is actually providing a guidance to companies on what is needed to be reported and make it out public in the report. So those will be the pillars. We can go already to the next. And starting with probably the most asked question ever, who will be affected by this regulation? So we actually divided the scope into 4 groups according to the timeline where they will have to comply with the rules. And starting with the group 1, this equals the scope of the non-financial reporting directive. So the companies that have to comply with those rules, they are the same as group 1 here on this slide, and they will have to have a threshold of minimum 500 employees to be in this group. And they will be actually the first ones into applying the rules. Then we have group 2. This as a different thing from group 1. It is not doesn't have to be a listed company. So just to clarify that, because I'm going to use this term a bit more along this presentation, listed companies are equals to public interest entities, but just in terms of simplifying things, we are using listed companies, because public interest entities, they are actually few groups. They are listed companies in an EU regulated market. They are also large banks, and they are large insurance companies as well. So for the digital advertising industry, what we should actually be looking at more often will be if your company is a listed company under an EU regulated market. So for group 2, it is actually directed to large companies that are not listed companies in an EU regulated market. And for that, they will have to have a minimum of 250 employees as a threshold, minimum of 40 million net turnover, and minimum of a balance sheet total of 20 million. So then we go to group 3, and group 3 is probably the most contentious one, because it is including that they have to be listed companies. So they have to be in an EU regulated market. And if they are licensed according to the EU regulation, to have a maximum of 250 employees. If it is above that, then they will enter in group 2.
Is it a challenge on my side, or has some?
No, I think we've lost. I'm just messaging her to get back on. I think we lost her internet. The joys of the virtual world. Wait us a second.
Sorry to everyone so far. Ines, you are back.
Yeah, I think I lost the connection for a second.
Yeah, you had some challenges. I think you probably still have some challenges.
Yes, I'm back. I hope.
Let's give it a try again. No.
Okay. I hope you can all hear me right now. I'm sorry for that. I think I got a technical problem. We're actually about the group 3. Can you hear me?
It's getting better again. Please go on. Or not. Lauren, is it just, it is on Ines' side, yeah?
No, I think I'm just messaging her to see if we can, maybe she just needs to reboot. Sorry about this.
No worries. That's also part of the digital life sometimes. It's not easy to jump back now to the panel before, but there was one open question.
I think she looks like she's active now. Are you there, Inés? I could see her for a second.
Yeah, let's give her a second. I think at the end, I know it could be quite a dry topic sometimes, but with the regulations, many things are starting to become better. And as you already see, it has a great impact of not just one part of the supply of the chain. You will also have to keep in mind there are some indirect impacts of these groups infecting others or smallers. So, Ines, are you back with us?
Yes, now I'm back. I think now
yes,
for real.
It sounds good now. It sounds better now. So please go on.
Okay, I'm glad. I'm glad. Thank you for holding the fort, Stefan. And lastly, I'm gonna speak about the group 4, because they are the companies that they are non-EU based. And these are also under the scope of the CSRD, which is something a bit more particular. But they are only under the scope of the CSRD if they comply with these two conditions. So first of all, the parent company that is outside of the EU, they have to have a threshold of minimum 150 million. And then they also need to have a subsidiary in the EU territory that surpass the threshold of 40 million euro net turnover. So as you see, it's slightly particular, and we'll speak about that in a minute. And they don't have to be a listed company, as you have seen. Okay, and in terms of timeline, and also because of the technical complexities we have, we're running out of time. As you can see, the group 1 is actually already having to comply with the rules and having to draft the reports as of the year 2024, and they will have to hand the reports in the year 2025. For group 2, that will be happening, they will be preparing their files, the reports on 2025, and they will report in 2026. When it comes to SMEs, that will happen, they will have to handle the reports in 2027. And for the group 4, so non-EU based companies, they will have to handle their reports in 2029. And we have there also an exception for SMEs, that they are actually allowed to postpone their reporting obligations until 2029. So they will be joining the group 4 in terms of obligations and reporting if they ask to do that. Okay, we can move to the next. And I think another aspect of the legislation that is quite important and also new in terms of EU regulation is the double materiality assessment. And this is linked to the next slide, so maybe we can go first to the next, and we will go back to that one. And it relates to the cross-cutting standards, European sustainability reporting standards. The ones that have been published, they are this table that you are seeing on the screen. So we have 2 that are the cross-cutting standards that all companies have to comply with, and they have to report on the same, let's say, data points. And then they have the topical standards. These are already published, and as you can see, you have different themes. So you have environment, that is reporting on pollution, reporting on water and marine resources, biodiversity. You have also social, working workforce, consumers and end users, and then you have governance. So for these topical standards, companies have to proceed with a double materiality assessment. So what it was in the previous slide. And if we can please go back. Thank you. To the next one. One more. No, to the materiality assessment. Yes, there you go. Thank you. So the materiality assessment, and to determine which topical standards companies need to comply with, they have to look outside and they have to look inside. So this means that a company will have to look at how environment and society can create risks and opportunities to their company. So that will be the inward impact. And then the outward impact will be what are the impacts of the company on society and environment. So you have those 2 types of materiality assessment, which equals what is important to the company when it comes to ESG. So when the board of directors, which is the ones that they have this set obligation to determine through the double materiality assessment, which topics are material, equal, important to them, then they will have a series of topics that they will know that they have to report on. And those series of topics that we can already gone to the next slide. Thank you. One before. There you go. They can be, for example, pollution. It can be also inward impact and outward impact at the same time. This can happen definitely, and this is conceived under the standards. Of course, it is actually very specific to each business and each business reality. And this is actually an aspect that we encourage members and also the digital advertising industry at large to seek legal advice on this particular issue, because I think it may be a bit more challenging to determine. There's other standards that are in the process of being drafted or in the plans of being drafted. We have can we go to the previous slide? Thank you. We have a few of them that they are, for example, the SMEs standards that they were gonna be drafted, but they are gonna be postponed until 2026 for the drafting. The same is gonna happen with standards that were meant for non-EU companies. So for those subsidiary companies that they need to follow the obligations, because they will actually have to report on their parent activity. So on that bigger company parent one that is outside of the EU. So for those specific situations, there is in the plans of the European Commission and the EFRAG, which is the body drafting those standards, to be drafted. But it has been postponed until 2026 to start drafting with that. And I think now we are coming to the question of why it's important. Can we stay in the previous slide? Thank you. Why is important to the why is the CSRD important to the digital advertising industry? And it is true that not all companies are under the scope. This is a regulation that is mostly directed to bigger companies and also listed companies. So it is a bit hard to see at first glance how is that going to affect my company if I'm not under the scope. But the reality is that for the companies that are actually under the scope, they may need data from partners for their reporting obligations. This actually mandates disclosure of this ESG impact and associated risk and opportunities. And that is how actually the CSRD impacts companies that are from the upstream and downstream from one big company that they maybe need to comply because they are under the scope. So that detailed information that companies are already planning on including in their reports, they may need from their business partners to provide another layer of information, another layer of analysis to get the most accurate and reliable information in their reports. So that is why actually for non-listed SMEs, there is also a plan for drafting standards for this that are gonna be having a they're gonna be voluntary for them standards, because they will be actually very simplified standards from the ones that have been already published, and it's really to aid and help these SMEs to be able to pass this information over to their business partners if they are already requesting that information from them. Still, we don't know the date of the developing of these standards, but we are definitely monitoring it from the working group in policy and regulation at IB Europe. Yes, so we can already move to the next and the last part of this presentation, which is the policy landscape for green rules in the EU. And we can go to the next slide. So we have in this slide basically all the commissioners that are having an important role when it comes to green rules developing at the European Commission. We have, of course, our current president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and we included her on this slide because actually under her mandate, it was when the EU Green Deal was set up and agreed. And from this EU Green Deal, all the rules that are on environment or ESG, they are coming from this. And the CSRD is one of them. The most The most reliable prediction that we have now is that probably Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen will be probably re-elected during the next term, but that's something still to be until the elections. And we have a changing landscape on the other directorates. For example, in the Directorate for Justice and Consumers, where we have Reniers, and actually he was in charge of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that you might have heard about this piece before. He actually might be leaving the European Commission for another role. Or we have also Mrs. McInnes from DG FISMA, which is the Directorate for Financial Matters, in charge of the CSRD, which most likely she will probably remain in power, but it's still TBD or TBC. And then we have Mr. Virginius from the Directorate of Environment, of course, one of the most important directorates for anything that has to do with green rules and Green Claims Directive. It's under this directorate. For this particular case, it may be less probable that this commissioner remains in power, as the political party that he belongs to is not really in line with the trend or political trend in Lithuania, where he is from. But it still is something to be confirmed and defined. There is not a lot of information at the moment until the elections in June. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you. As I said before, we have upcoming elections that they are happening in June, and we're already seeing a very changing landscape in terms of green rules. I think this is probably the best day that it could have happened, the presentation, in terms of showing the situation in the EU and Brussels, since we are starting the day with farmers' protests and all these context of farmers' protest, and also a trend of a more conservative EU over around all the member states is going to really dictate how the agenda of political priorities is going to look like. A quote that Mr. Virginius actually said is that we are seeing a trend now of the more center-right political parties that used to support the Green Deal now to acquire more right-wing arguments and quotas against these green rules. So maybe we actually see a change in priorities. And we are already seeing, for example, some of the green rules that they are being watered down, for example, the CSRD. But still, everything is to be defined, and we are not gonna know for sure what is gonna be the landscape until the June elections. So we'll have to wait. How is this gonna affect to the CSRD? You may be wondering, and we can move to the next slide to dive into that. So we are already seeing a bit of this in terms of that the European Commission has instructed the EFRAG, which is the body that is drafting the ESRS, to continue refining the cross-sectorial standards and not to start just now with the sectoral standards. Those standards are meant for particular industries. So for example, oil and gas, mining, textile, we can consider them the high impact sectors. Just to clarify, there is no plans to develop any sectoral standard on the digital advertising industry, if you were just wondering that, or the digital industry at large. So these sectoral standards are gonna take a backseat. They are gonna be delayed, as I just said before in the previous slides, and that's gonna happen the same with the non-EU companies standards, and they are gonna only be drafted in 2026. For non-EU companies, this is not gonna really make a difference, since in any case, they will have to report on 2029. So for their timeline, it's really not affecting a lot. And what is actually remaining here in this years are the implementation, and how I want to also finalize this presentation with is that even though we have this changing environment in green rules, what is already said under the rules and law is that the CSRD is here to stay, and also the standards that are the ESRS. And actually, the first set of companies, they are already preparing their reporting for 2024 to be handled in 2025. So definitely this is a legislation and rules that are gonna be staying with us for a long time. And let's see what is up next in the future. I think this is everything from my side in terms of presentation, but now I guess we have a Q&A session.
Yeah, I think we had one question regarding policy changes, but I think it's now very well answered already, as we have to learn as we go with the upcoming changes in business reality with the ESRS, CSRD, and all the other beautiful things. I see no more question regarding policy. The other question regarding ad fraud, I keep in mind for the last panel, but also probably our next speaker will address this. And so it's thank you, Ines, for the insights and valuable knowledge. I'm pretty sure you have definitely given our audience a lot of things to think about when it comes to policy. And I hope the jumble of letters from Brussels hasn't frightened too many people. Keep an eye on it. It will be increasingly be able to affect your business.